Hi. I'm coming live today to speak about the Rings of Power. Um, and it's been a shocker. I received a lot of messages from you guys um, concerning the final episode, so the season finale, episode 8. And I have a lot of things to talk about in regards to that particular episode. It's been a surprise. It's been a very shocking sort of episode. I wasn't expecting half of the things that happened in that episode to happen. I personally feel as though the episode had a lot of things in it, a lot of developments in it that were not made necessarily clear earlier on. And so when the episode aired, it felt like a lot of things that should have been developed were not developed at all, and they weren't um and so it felt rushed, really. That's my main issue with episode 8. But I'm sure everyone has seen it by now, but for those of you who haven't seen it, the major developments of episode 8 of The Rings of Power was basically the fact that Halbrand, this human character that we have seen accompany Galadriel thus far, turns out to be Sauron. A few people had spoken about that. Personally, I stayed away from reactions to the show just because I wanted to have a sort of unbiased opinion. I don't really want to echo what other people are saying. So I tried not to watch a lot of reactions. I tried not to watch people's sort of opinions of the show. I tried to keep away from that sort of thing. But now that the season has come to an end, I personally made it my mission to sort of go and see what other people were saying about it, especially this last episode. And the opinion hasn't been great. Some people obviously have loved it, have thought that the reveal of Sauron being Halbrand and the way he sort of tries to persuade Galadriel to come to his side um, was interesting. But my overall gut feeling about the season finale is that it was rushed. And so I just kind of wanted to talk about why I think it's rushed because I think that it's easy to levy sort of accusations at the show and talk about how bad it is without actually offering a suggestion on what could have been made better, what could have been done about making the show better. Personally, I think that the formation or the forging of the rings should have been the main storyline. Forget Numenor coming to Middle Earth, forget the Harfoots, forget all of that. Let's make the formation of the rings the main storyline. Let's not actually see us forging the rings in the season finale. That feels sort of counterproductive. If the rings are supposed to be everything that we're gearing up towards, I wanted the making of the rings to be front line and center. And it didn't feel like that was the case. In fact, we get just a series of montages and half heard conversations to give us an idea of what we're supposed to expect from the creation of this thing that's supposedly going to save the elves. So I think that it should have been a lot more spaced out. There was so much filler in the show that the actual storyline was forgotten. And that's just um the unfortunate thing that played out with this series. It could have been a good series. Um, I think I had a lot of hope because there were some aspects of the series that I think were good and some aspects of the series that um were not great, but if developed properly could have really enhanced it. But all the negative aspects of the series, the writing, for example, really really reared its ugly head in this season finale because rushing or lack of pacing is a writing issue. It's not something that we can criticize the actors for. Largely, the actors have done, I think, their best of what they've been given. Um, it's not something that we can levy at this phenomenon of wokeness that we like to criticize for everything. But bad writing really is what plagued this series, because you can have something that passes along the message, you can have something that is trying to beat a certain type of narrative over our heads, but if it's written well, then it's not as bad. For example, when we have anything that refers to allegory, like Animal Farm, for example, the message it's trying to give is pretty much sort of beaten down over your head, but it's enjoyable to read. So we don't really mind that this is an obvious critique of communist Russia. We just like the story. It's an interesting story. It makes us feel for the characters, all while we know that this is very obviously allegory. So it's not a storyline trying to pass along a very obvious message. That's the problem. It's the fact that that message was not written very well. And so with the Rings of Power, even though it was trying to introduce diversity into Tolkien's works in a way that Tolkien himself diverting from what Tolkien himself already had introduced with the different racial groups in the global south of Middle Earth, and the Edain who were, you know, sort of friends of the elves and had fairer skin, but you also had darker skinned people. They had, despite the fact that they decided to go about introducing diversity in their own way, it didn't have to be such a bad thing if the writing was just done well. But it wasn't, and so it it landed flat. Better writing was done on the Shadow of War game than the Rings of Power series. I'm pretty sure the Shadow of War game was not given $1 billion. So that's disappointing. To go to the comments, Ian says, we knew he was Sauron from day one, lol. And first, the hashtag one lobster says, hey, hi, lobster. But I mean, I don't think it was entirely obvious that this character was Sauron. I get what they were trying to do because I think once you go back, you can kind of see that okay, they were setting him up to be something um something more sinister, but I don't think the writing itself was done well enough that we suspected this character of being Sauron. Um Aragma says the leaks were all true. Um, and Ian says, oh yeah, it was blatant. Total screw up in the writing that allowed it. Um, I think from what I watched, the series didn't give a clear indication of a character that could have. I Let me rephrase this. I think that the character they were trying to write Sauron to be was not as they kind of put him in a background because Halbrand didn't seem like the type of character that could play Sauron. And this issue is actually brought up in the season finale. For example, when he tries to convince Galadriel to join him, it doesn't seem like a very well thought out plan. And this is supposedly the person who allied under Morgoth, who was his second hand man. I don't know whether he was trying to play off the fact that oh maybe Galadriel has looked into the darkness so much that she will be partial to siding with an actual Dark Lord, but it didn't seem very well thought out for a character that's being set up to be the big evil guy of the Third Age. And this is another problem with the series is that it's bad guys um, are not actually strong enough for the heroes to look heroic. You know, your hero is only as heroic as your villain is villainous. So if your villains are weak, easily defeated, or they scurry away at the slightest bit of confrontation, then your heroes don't actually look heroic. They don't actually look like they're doing anything. So Ian says bingo, writing problem. Yes, that was the big issue with the show. It's writing issues, the fact that the characterization wasn't always the best. Um, the fact that certain characters, um, their developments were not written well enough, or we weren't shown those developments enough to really align ourselves with those characters. Let's take the relationship between Bronwyn and Arandir, for example. Their romance wasn't really developed well because as a couple, there really isn't any sort of spark between them. We don't know why these two would even get together. We there's no sort of catalyst that we saw that really makes us root for this couple. We weren't rooting for them at all. For example, Bronwyn will die relatively soon. She's not one of the Dunedain, so we know that they don't have years on their side. You know, she's her living conditions, even though she's a healer, her living conditions ensure that she's not really living up to the age of 80. That's a good living that's a good sort of standard of living even for today. So for the age that Bronwyn is living in, yeah, she's not living very long. But for some reason, Arondir is enthralled with this woman, and we haven't seen enough of their relationship to really understand why they like each other that much. And comparatively, we could levy that same sort of critique at Arwen and um, Aragorn. We didn't see a lot of their relationship. We saw little bits of their relationship, but we didn't see a lot. But the difference is the things that we did see of Aragorn and Arwen's relationship were enough for us to really cement the fact that we liked them. They also played on the sort of archetypal princess and knight relationship, which is which we're very familiar with, which is a sort of archetype that we can fill in ourselves. And so it's easier to digest that than Bronwyn and Arondir's relationship, which just it doesn't have an archetypal backing. So the audience is sort of feeling it out for the first time, and we're not given enough for us to really like these characters as a couple. They're not terrible characters, but I didn't really feel anything for them. And I was really trying to give this show as much of a chance as I could. So Aragna says they tried their hand at making Sauron a sympathetic villain. Ian says exactly Aragna. Aragna replies, I wish they didn't waste these millions. Um, it is a horrid waste. It is really a horrid waste of money. Um, I had hope for this series because I thought there were going to be more episodes. That's probably an oversight on my part because I probably should have known how many episodes there were going to be in season one. I'm pretty sure that information was out there and very easy to find, but due to negligence on my part, I just don't know. But um I thought they would have more time. So there were certain things that I believed given time they would develop. I was willing to accept that, okay, episode 1 to 7 is just a very slow start and a very unencouraging start, but it could get better with more episodes. But for episode 8 to be the season finale, and for everything that should have been at the very forefront get rushed into season 8, oh, that to me was horrendous. It felt like a really quick episode because there was just too much that they had to do in order to fit it in to episode 8. So in episode 8, just to give you a sort of comparison between what occurs in the other episodes, and what occurs in episode 8. From episode 1 to 7, we have this introduction to characters. All that really happens is that Galadriel doesn't go to Valinor. She meets Halbrand. The two of them rally the Numenorians to come to Middle Earth. They end up coming to Middle Earth and fighting a battle. Elrond and the High King are trying to look for a way for the elves to maintain their light so that they can remain in Middle Earth. And for that, they're sort of going back and forth with the dwarves because the Dwarven King doesn't want the mining of Mithril because it's very dangerous, and he's sort of becoming very close-minded. That's the gist. So, and then also towards the end of episode 6 and episode 7, we have the creation of Mordor. So it took us 7 episodes to get that, what could really have been done in 3 episodes at most. 3 episodes at most, and we could have established the creation of Mordor and all of that. We could have done all of that in 3 episodes. Then, but that took 7. Now, season 8. So, episode 8, I don't know why I keep saying seasons, but episode 8, we get, not only do we get the confirmation of the character of the hobo character to be Gandalf, we have the revelation that Halbrand is Sauron. We have the creation of the 3 most important rings in Middle Earth besides the One Ring itself and arguably the other 9. But we have all of these things that all happen in one episode. And all this background filler takes place over 7 episodes. That's just to give you an idea of just how rushed episode 8 is. And how just blatantly bad the pacing of this show is. So let's see. Aragna says, they made so many people sad and the core Tolkien fans even angry. They could have been more respectful and truthful. I definitely agree. Seeing as episode 8 is the last episode of this season, I have to say I'm disappointed. I don't really understand why on earth they would go for this storyline, knowing very well that your first season ultimately decides whether your series is a flop or a pass. And they decided to make it a flop by angering everybody who cares about this franchise, and by going against a story that was literally on a platter for them. They just had to do a little bit of fleshing out, just use a little bit of creativity, and you could have really had a good story. But they chose to focus on their own story and then drastically try and bring in all the elements from Tolkien into the last episode of a whole season. That doesn't really speak well of their creative abilities. It doesn't speak well of their planning. And I don't know if they will have the sort of reception that they want for the second season, if there will be one. There probably will be, because I think they're going to have a second season just to attempt to make back a lot of the money that they would have lost. But yeah, it's been an overall disappointment, and I really don't understand why competent writers were not selected. Because even with this current storyline that they're going with, if it had just been written better, if certain scenes had been changed around, if certain scenes had been added, for example, us spending time with Galadriel as a likable character before she becomes this warrior person that we confront. If we could have spent some time with characters who are familiar, with characters who are likable, with characters who uh, we form an emotional attachment with, it would have been easier to go through this series. But because that wasn't really done, the series has turned out to be quite the disappointment. So Lobster says, I have no hope for anything made in the West anymore. Classics and anime are all I bother with now. Um, I personally can't agree with that sentiment. However, um, I'm not gonna lie, I can't personally I can't agree again, yeah, with that sentiment that anything sort of produced by the global West is somehow condemned to being bad. Because we have a very real example of something that can be done well in the other series that is being produced at the moment, which is House of Dragon, which in comparison to um to Rings of Power is miles better. And I'm going to be doing an episode by episode comparison of the two series just to talk about the writing issues and what could have been fixed and what House of Dragon does better and what um, Rings of Power does well but not quite so well. So I think that, and I'm not doing that to bash Rings of Power and just to keep celebrating House of Dragon. I think it's going to be a very educational sort of project to embark on, because not everything about Rings of Power was god awful. Um, there were things that I liked. The character of Ada, for example, was very interesting. Um, I was intrigued by the relationship between Elrond and Durin, and Elrond's sort of interaction with the dwarves overall. I was also kind of a little bit invested in the the relationship between the Prince Durin and the King Durin, and to see how he overcomes that sort of patriarchal figure in his life, which is sort of stifling his own growth, because um, in a lot of mythological stories, the boy who wishes to be a man has to almost supplant the old patriarchy and become a new one. We see this a lot in Shakespeare's plays, where the two young lovers have to um, have to almost push against the old family unit in order to create a new one. In a lot of Shakespeare's plays, the patriarch is the opposition to this union of marriage, which is ironic because we always view marriage, especially in modern discourse, as being this very patriarchal and oppressive system. But in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, the person who opposes a union of marriage usually tends to be the patriarch. So I was intrigued by um, the relationship between King Durin and Prince Durin, and I wanted to see how he overcomes this and what becomes of that relationship and whether it can be remedied. So there were aspects of Rings of Power that were intriguing, that could potentially be good stories, but because they were put into the hands of incompetent writers, it was really difficult for these good elements to fully come to fruition. Um, so let's say Aragma says there are many indie authors who work hard to create old story escapism. Ian says Galadriel helped create Mordor. Really? Lol, facepalm. Yes, I agree with that sentiment. Galadriel helping to create the very evil that she so diligently worked hard to vanquish. It doesn't make sense. I don't understand why they made that decision not to just have Mordor there. But well, I say I don't understand that decision. I do understand it from their storytelling perspective. The thing is, a lot of the showrunners' choices are difficult to understand when we look at them from the perspective of Tolkien fans. but we have to look at them from the perspective of the showrunner's own writing, which is what I said last time when I was talking about Galadriel. Galadriel can only be understood if you separate her from what was in the books. She is not the Galadriel of the books. In the series, they're presenting Galadriel as this morally grey, um, very abrupt, very sort of proud, villainous character. That's who they are creating Galadriel out to be. They're not creating her out to be the good guy. Even though she's fighting for the right side, her obsession is sort of being framed as her dark side. They want to show her us as an audience the sort of folly of becoming one with the darkness, which is the stupid advice that her brother gave her, which doesn't align with any of Tolkien's ideals whatsoever. But that's what they decided to do in the show. The show has a different ethos from Tolkien's work. And I think if we continue to try and judge it by Tolkien's standards, then everything seems like it's just everywhere. You have to sort of look at the series from its own internal logic. If not, we end up saying the same thing over and over again, and we sound like a broken record. It's not even trying to be Tolkien-esque. It's just taking his work and taking his characters' names and doing something entirely different. I recently watched someone play the Shadow of War, and it was a very long watch. I think I spent a week watching this person play this game, and I was following the storyline of the Shadow of War. It's Tolkien-esque, but it's not the story that Tolkien wrote. People who love Celebrimbor will absolutely hate what was done with him. If they're still looking at him as a character that Tolkien wrote, watching that gameplay of the Shadow of War kind of gave me a different perspective on the Rings of Power and gave me a different way of looking at it. You can't judge it as Tolkien's work, which doesn't make sense because it's literally using Tolkien's name. I know, it's crazy. But you kind of have to look at it from the internal logic of the series itself. It's trying to I don't understand how this doesn't count as plagiarism, because literally what the show is trying to do is just create a story in what they view as the cracks in Tolkien's work. But Galadriel isn't supposed to be the Galadriel that we know. She's supposed to be this morally grey, almost very human sort of character with flaws and with her own internal darkness, and she's been corrupted by war, and that's the character we're following. We're not following the Lady Galadriel from the books. And so when I look at the series and when I look at Galadriel helping to create Mordor, it's a physical manifestation of her own sort of obsession with darkness, that she really has um, created the very thing that she was trying to fight against. It also works from what they were trying to do with the plot, because they wanted a plot where Sauron and his orcs have all but disappeared from the face of the earth. And so if Mordor was always this fiery place, it would be a very obvious place to look for the orcs in. And so what they're trying to do is say, well, Galadriel, they're almost trying to have us believe in Galadriel and against the elves, who have a tangible point that there is no evidence that Sauron and his orcs are still at large. There's no flaming volcano with a fortress, which would have been Mordor. There's no place that we've searched that they are. And that's the premise they're trying to set. So Galadriel helping to create Mordor is sort of works twofold. She reveals that yes, Sauron and his minions and orcs are still at large, but it also works as a storytelling point because she physically sees the horror of what her obsession has produced. It made her run into a situation without thinking. It made her rely on her own judgment and consult with nobody. And this is what she's done, which is why she blames herself for it. And Theo sort of goes through the whole thing of, no, it's not your fault, it's actually mine because I gave them the sword. But that's the internal logic of the series itself. It makes no sense when you look at it as a Tolkien story. But if you just follow the internal logic of the story itself, that's what it's trying to do. Now we can argue about whether it does it well or whether it does it badly. I'm arguing that it doesn't do it well. So Aragna says the Nazguls were a table flip. If Hobolth wasn't enough, he also adds Galadriel. Sure, they could have pulled off a Xena had they tried properly. Ian says night and day comparison with House of Dragon. It really is a night and day comparison in some areas. I think there's a lot to be learned from a comparison between the two. This channel has a lot of writers or people who appreciate writing. And I think that sometimes, as writers, it can seeing an example of bad writing is not necessarily enough. I think we have to know why that's bad writing. We may not like something, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad writing. Now, am I saying that the Rings of Power does have good write is written well and we just don't like it just because? No, that's not what I'm saying. But this comparison is almost seeing why the Rings of Power isn't as great and why the House of Dragon is better. It's not just because it actually stayed loyal somewhat to the books. It's because the showrunners of the House of Dragon selected good writers. Not only did they have the actual author on board, but they had good writers who were able to adapt that to screen. A common mistake is thinking that you can just take a book and shove it onto a screen. That doesn't work. There are elements that you just can't translate. So a screenwriter has to be a skillful screenwriter. And for House of Dragon, they have skillful screenwriters. For Rings of Power, they do not. And it's useful for us as writers, appreciators of good writing, readers, whatever we are. It's good for us to see how that works and why certain decisions work and why certain decisions do not work. So it's not just a comparison to make fun of it, but a comparison to learn. So Joseph says in House of Dragon, you can see a guy walk down the hallway, and I'm infinitely invested more than anything in Rings of Power. And there's a reason for that. The reason is we know that every single action in a House of Dragon that is shown to us has a meaning. It it is a setup. So we know and we're paying attention to everything because we know that this action will have an equal and opposite reaction. So we know that everything we're seeing, it's not there for no reason. Whereas in Rings of Power, a lot of things are shown to us for no reason whatsoever except for aesthetic value. There is no reason for us to see Galadriel just riding somewhere. There's no need for us to see them riding anywhere unless it means something, unless it adds something to the overall scene. We know that Lyanna and Daemon are getting closer because we see them riding together. When we see Elendil and Galadriel riding together, it's just so we can focus on her pretty dress and the white horse that she's riding down a beach. It has no meaning whatsoever, and that's why we're captivated by everything that we see in House of Dragon, and we're not in Rings of Power because we know that there's nothing interesting and nothing important that's going to come out of this scene, and we take that attitude into everything else. It is the job of the writer or the screenwriter or whoever's directing to understand that you are the person who shapes the interest or shapes the attitude of the viewer, of the reader going forward. If you do a bunch of pointless scenes, then don't be surprised when your viewers aren't interested in anything else going forward, because you've shown us that we can basically just ignore half of this and still get a sort of gist of your show, and it's not that interesting anyway. So Ragnar says Xena was very likable and we rooted for her throughout her adventures. Yes, we did. Even though Xena started out as a villain, because not too long ago I rewatched the first episode of Xena. Even though she started out as a villain, and we sort of get a glimpse of her conquests, very quickly we come to Xena as a heroic figure. She's a villain, everyone hates her. But in the first episode, where do we sort of find Xena? She's leaving that past behind. We don't even get to see the full extent of that past, but she's leaving it behind, and she's going on this. She's leaving it behind. She's burying her armor. She's burying everything. But almost as soon as she does that, these girls are being taken. Gabrielle being one of them, her future sidekick. Um, and we see her take up that armor again, not to pillage and take advantage of people and kill people, but to defend. And so our first impressions of Xena are extremely important. And we spend time not in the violence, but we spend time um with Xena in her home. She goes back to her home village. We see the reception there. We see how she tries to make things right. We see how she's not apologizing or trying to defend her decisions. She knows what she's done wrong and she knows who she is, but she's not shying away from that. And she also knows that I'm trying to make an effort to be a better person. So there is a different sort of ability to write a character in Xena's presentation, and the writers know that just because your character is a female does not mean that we instantaneously like her, that we instantly like her. It doesn't mean that we're going to root for her just because she's a woman. You have to make her a likable character. You have to show her in a certain light. It doesn't mean that Xena was this great person who all women should look up to. No, it just meant that the writers knew she had been a villain. They knew that she was capable of violence. They knew that she had a dark past. But the way that they presented the series the way that they presented this information to us was manipulated in a way that, despite all of this, we're still going to follow this character and root for them. They could have done the same with Galadriel, but they chose not to. For what reason, I do not know why. So let's see. Arachne says, Rings of Power ended quite badly, pretty weak writing, and for all the money they spent, a horrible waste. And then quite a sarcastic comment there from Aragma. But Malika writes, Guy Ladriel is a nuanced grey hero. How dare you criticize the showrunners for writing the novel Tolkien couldn't have written? Um, because it's pretty presumptuous of anyone to say that you can write something better than the creator. Um, there are reasons why we have this assumption. For example, we're living in this sort of era where we think the author can at once be divorced quite easily from their work. But if they had any unsanitary ideas, then they automatically are sort of linked with their work, and their work is garbage. And this is the sort of world that we're operating in. This is the world of thought that we're sort of operating in, where we have people who think they can handle someone's creation better because they believe that the writer is somewhat divorced from the project, and that once the project has been written, it belongs to the fans. And this excuse is used to justify changes to someone's work. For example, the race of their characters, the gender of their characters, and the sexuality of their characters. Well, because the writer's beliefs don't matter. It's the public's once it's been published. And there is that school of thought. But on the other hand, if that writer was perhaps homophobic, or that writer had anti-Semitic ideas, then immediately that their ideas are associated with their work, and their work is also condemned and seen as not valuable. And we see that even with J.K. Rowling, because she had ideas that people didn't like, the sales of her books went down. And it's because we know, even though we use the idea of the death of the author, we know that the author is intrinsically linked to their work. And because there's no integrity anymore when it comes to discussions. Um, there's no integrity in our politics. There's no integrity in the way that we discuss works of fiction. There's no integrity in the way that we even go about our daily lives for the most part in popular culture. It's easy to flip flop between these two ideas whenever it suits anyone. And that's why I'm criticizing it. That's why I'm criticizing this idea, because really think a lot about artistic integrity. As someone who one day wants to write a novel myself, I would turn in my grave if someone thought they could write it better than me, because you weren't there during the long months of this project. You weren't there when I was coming up with the idea. You weren't there when I was writing endless drafts. If you were in that process, then by all means write the novel. But if you were not there, then please sit down. And that's sort of my attitude towards it. Obviously, people who don't have that attitude would argue that once, and several scholars have argued that once a work has been published, it now belongs to the audience, and the author can't control the way it's been um, viewed. And that's why the Tolkien Convention could talk about a homosexual, sorry, a transgender Gondor or a queer Saruman because of this school of thought. But at the same time, they also wanted to levy the accusation of racism against Tolkien because of the perceived lack of diversity. And that is the sort of environment that we're living in. That's sort of intellectual environment that we're living in. So again, that's why I criticize ideas like this, because you can't eat your cake and have it. You have to choose one. Either the author is separate from their work, and so it's open for interpretation, and therefore, what we're arguing is that you can't, you can write the novel that they didn't write, but you also can't argue that they're racist or homophobic or sexist. You can't attach the author to their work, and you can't use their name when you're trying to fanfic their work. So we have to choose a camp. We can't sort of eat our cake and have it. So let's see. Arachne says screenwriting is quite different from book writing. Exactly. And that's why just because someone can write a good story does not mean they are a good screenwriter. There are different rules in that game. And so perhaps the screenwriters of The Rings of Power are brilliant story writers. They're brilliant book writers. You know, they can spin you a story that will captivate you and keep you on edge. But in translating all of that to screen, that's a different sort of ball game. And there are very simple things that I personally believe it takes more than just being able to write a story to be able to adapt things to screen. It's a different medium, and so you need someone who has experience and who has particular expertise in that medium. Christopher says, I could not watch past the first two episodes. It just did not feel right. I definitely agree, Christopher. I had to sort of ground myself and sit through it. Obviously, I'd made a commitment on my channel to review it and to actually watch it and give it a chance and tell people my opinions. So there was obviously that aspect of why I stuck through it. But if I had to watch it on my own, I personally don't think I could have stuck through the whole thing. Perhaps curiosity would have taken me through and just to see. Um, and just to add to this point, yes, I will probably watch season two, um, just so that um, I can review it all. But not because I think it's a great story. And I also won't lie, part of me is curious to see whether they'll dig themselves out, like out of this hole. You know when you're watching a car crash and you're like, this is horrible, but I'm curious. And so that's me with this series. I'm curious. I want to know what they do, how it ends, and not because it's great. It's just because it's it's bad to the point where I'm like, it can only get better from here. It can't get any worse than this, can it? And so there's that curiosity. which is not great. You don't want your series to have this sort of reputation where people are just watching it to see whether the car blows up after it crashes. We shouldn't have that reaction to your series. But they've crashed so badly that I'm sort of just wondering, can it get worse? Will the whole car blow up? And if it does, how much of the damage are we going to see? And it's pretty sadistic to think that way, but it's I'm curious. So let's see. Arachne says one is story showing and the other is storytelling. That's actually a really good way of putting it. So the what Arachne is saying is the difference between screenwriting and book writing is that one is storytelling and the other is story showing. And it seems straightforward, but it's actually a very good point because, like I was saying earlier, with the point I brought up, or the point I was expanding on about what makes us like Xena versus Galadriel. It's what we see. So it's not that Xena didn't have a dark past, just the same way Galadriel has a dark and sort of tortured past in this series. It's what we see. We spend time with a Xena that's likable, that's witty, that's funny, has a sense of humor, and we spend time with grouchy, problematic, annoying, rude, bossy, just downright terrible Galadriel. And we don't spend time with Galadriel that danced and that Celeborn fell in love with. We don't spend time with that Galadriel. And so it's difficult to like her. And even when we see her relationship with Elrond and we sort of get, okay, she wasn't always like this, and we see a softer side of her with Elrond, especially in episode 8. I was thinking to myself, why didn't we get this earlier? Why couldn't we just get this Galadriel earlier? Why did we have to get bossy, leave your companions behind, obsessive, creates Mordor? Because now what the writers have to do is sort of fight against the perception they created, which is a lot harder than just creating a positive perception, feeding us the dark parts and letting us come to terms with it. It's like baking. You don't just dump all your ingredients in. You have to know when to add the sugar, when to you don't just when it says whisk, when you're baking and it says whisk, that doesn't mean throw everything in and whisk everything at the same time, which is what a lot of sort of amateur bakers do, is that they say, okay, add your butter in here, add your sugar, so they just put everything in. But an experienced baker will know that you have to, as you're whisking, you gradually add your butter, which you have melted. You gradually add the sugar in. You wait, you fold that mixture in, then you add a little bit again. And you're using the same amount that they gave you on the instructions, but the way in which you add these ingredients, the patience and time that you use to fold these ingredients into the mixture is what will make the difference on your final result. And it's as simple and as complicated as it sounds. So let's go back to the comments. The Arachne makes another great point. The Rings of Power showrunners forgot about Chekhov's gun. If you see a gun in the opening scene of your series, show, movie, film, whatever, that gun has to go off at some point, which is the point that Arachne is making with that. You can't just have things lying about or make us see things for no reason. We have to see how that comes to fruition. For example, in the final episode, we see Elendil's daughter go into the throne room and go. She's sketching the picture of the king because the king's about to die. You see her sketching the picture. The king has sort of kind of wakes up from his little sleep or whatever he's in and tells her that, oh, you're going to be uh the next queen. He basically alludes to that, and we're all like, okay, fine, she's going to be the next queen. He tells her to go into the room with the Palantir. We never see her again. We don't see that scene. Bear in mind that we come back to Numenor. It's not the last time we ever see Numenor because the king dies and we see the black flags. So we come back to Numenor. But what happens with Elendil's daughter and the Palantir, we never see. And we're just supposed to hold on till next season to find out what happened. You have way too much faith in your show if you think that people are going to sit down and wait for a whole new season to find out what one girl did in one room with all the other things in your plot going on. But those are the sort of unfinished storylines that they give us. These are the sort of, and it's not even one that's really developed. We could have seen that that wasn't a massively important point, but because of their lack of expertise, they do things like that that don't really make sense. And they make decisions that are just jarring. So Ragu has also added, I am not a screenwriter, and somehow I am aware of it. Never waste screen time for a pointless display. Everything shown must drive the story forward. That is precisely the point that the showrunners seem to have missed. I will admit that they got a little bit better at it as the episode sort of went on, but still, there were a lot of things that didn't play out properly or just weren't done properly. There were a lot of other issues as well with the show. The dialogue, the dialogue being the massive issue, and so it was very. The dialogue didn't really convey what I felt like it was supposed to convey. And I could see parts where they lifted whole chunks of Peter Jackson's dialogue and put it into the series, especially in episode 8. It was never more clear than in episode 8. Like, even if you were trying to ignore it, as I was, you couldn't run away from the fact that whole chunks of Peter Jackson's writing had just been lifted and placed into episode 8 without the proper context. And so it just felt odd and it was jarring. As someone who's watched those movies several times over, it was really just, yeah, it was a bit of an experience.
I'm not sure I understand.
My phone just decided to enter the chat. But let's see what's going on in the chat. Lobster says, would the Harry Potter books and movies be better if Hermione was the main character? People often say that Harry himself is a Mary Sue. No. I don't think the books would have been better if Hermione was the main character. A lot of people who say that actually have never read the books and don't understand what Hermione's character was created to do. Let's look at Hermione for a second. Hermione is a middle-class girl with two parents. Bear in mind, Hermione's parents are both professionals. One of her parents, I'm not sure which, I haven't read the books in a long time, but one of her parents is a dentist. That's a middle-class profession. She's had both parents. She's an only child. She's very well educated, probably private schooled before she came to Hogwarts, which is why she's so eloquent in comparison to her peers. Her parents are fully supportive, which is why this child who is Muggle-born and her parents know nothing about magic is able to have all the access to the resources that she needs, is able to fully read a Hogwarts history before she gets to Hogwarts. We're dealing with a character that has nothing wrong in their lives. Before she gets to Hogwarts, Hermione is as straight as a pin. She's more obsessed with getting expelled than dying. This is a character who, by no stretch of the imagination, should be the main character of Harry Potter. There is no trauma in this child's life. She has been given the perfect childhood, or as close to perfect. And when I say perfect, that's as close to perfect as we can get as human beings. So there's nothing wrong in her life. She has no trauma. She has no driving force. What would be the incentive for Hermione to face Voldemort in first year? She doesn't even know really who Voldemort is. She just read about him vaguely. Voldemort isn't coming after Hermione. So Voldemort doesn't want anything to do with Hermione. In fact, he wants her kicked out because she's Muggleborn. So there's no way the books would have been better with Hermione as the main character. What, this privileged girl has to somehow has to find herself deliberately in trouble. The only time Hermione finds herself in trouble is because she's trying to police Harry and Ron. And so by sort of trying to figure out what they're doing, she finds herself in troublesome situations. And through her friendship with them, be careful the friends you keep, but through her friendship, she finds herself in life-threatening situations. Great. But other than that, Hermione would have no sort of she's not even adventurous in the sense that she's a Quidditch player. Even Quidditch terrifies her. To get on a broom, she's one of the worst students in flight class. This is not a character who has the tenacity to carry a story like Harry Potter. Whereas Harry was specifically created and designed to be traumatized for that role. Anyone calling Harry a Mary Sue has not read the books. I haven't watched the films in a very long time, but I'm pretty sure Harry doesn't just get everything off the bat. Even his Patronus charm, Harry had to dig deep for that one. And it took the near death of somebody for his Patronus to really become what it was. All of Harry's victories or powers come at the of real cost. For him to be able to even cast an evil sort of charm, which is the Cruciatus Curse, he had to lose his godfather, the only sort of semblance of a connection to his parents that he had, other than Remus. But Harry finally felt like he had a family and it was ripped from him. In the fifth book, he spends most of the summer just in the summer after Sirius dies, which is the sixth, he spends most of it depressed, refusing to eat, refusing to come out of his room. He blames himself. In the end of his fifth year, he screams that he no longer wants to be not humans, human, before trashing Dumbledore's office. This is not a character who just walks his way through life merry and jolly. This is a character who is tested. Obviously, we have to accept that Harry Potter is a children's book. They're not going to mentally break him like he's Guts from Berserk. But for a children's book, my God, he goes through a lot. And that's the reason why we sympathize with him. That's why he's the hero. I remember a child I was tutoring. I'd read Harry Potter so much that the reason why I liked Harry sort of escaped me. And so I asked her, why do you like Harry? Because I just noticed as I was teaching her that she had a really positive reaction to Harry and she was rooting for him. And we had really just made it into chapter 3 of the first book. And I was wondering, why is she so passionate about this character? And so I was curious. I asked her, why do you like him? And she says, because he's going through so much. And I don't like the fact that he's suffering like this. Remember, the first chapter of Harry Potter, we don't even see him. All we get is the Dursleys going about their day. And we learn that Harry is going to come to the Dursleys. The Dursleys are deliberately portrayed in a negative light so that we know that this infant who's going to come to them is going to suffer. And that's great story writing. You set up the scene to create the desired effect. That's not what Rings of Power does. And so, to answer your question, Lobster, no, Hermione would not have made a great main character. She's good where she is. And no matter how many fan fictions try and recast everybody, no, she wouldn't have made a great hero for the Harry Potter verse. She was not designed to be that way. You'd have to drastically rewrite her and everything about her to fit her into that role. So Corey says they keep telling us Galadriel is great. Show, don't tell. Um, Arondir Galadriel, commander of the Northern armies, with awe in his eyes. Okay. Yes, that's a very important point. We see certain characters look at Galadriel with awe. We see certain characters speak about Galadriel in a really positive way. But when we view Galadriel without those characters around, she doesn't come across as great. We see her abandon people, get visibly angry when they rightfully mutiny against her for decisions that she's made, even though she's disregarding the High King, who's supposed to have more authority than her. But she's supposedly great. When we are alone with Galadriel, we don't see this greatness, and so it's difficult to convince the viewers of what the characters are seeing. Obviously, I get that Arondir being, a small time guard, um, in one sort of deserted outpost, seeing Galadriel is going to have that reaction. So I'm not begrudging him of that reaction, and I'm not saying that they were wrong for putting that reaction there. I'm saying that when we are alone with Galadriel, we also should be able to share in some of that awe. And it can't come from her taking down one snow troll by herself, that sort of, and that snow troll whipping everybody else's butts, and Galadriel just comes in with a disgruntled face, like, why are you guys even taking time with this, and defeats it. That's not how you show us a character is great. If you're going to show us a character is heroic, you have to actually show us that character being heroic, meaning portraying heroic characteristics, being honest, being kind, being loyal. Galadriel so far has been none of those things. She's manipulated people for her own gain. She's been judgmental. She's just been cruel in some cases, said horrible things, and then lamented about it later on. Remorse isn't remorse in addition to action that shows us that your character is actually remorseful. You looking sad and saying, well, I shouldn't have done that, and I just got angry in there and I saw the darkness. That's not remorse, because abusers use that very same language to justify what they've done. It doesn't mean they're remorseful. Action, showing us a character behaving a certain way, is what is going to convince us of their heroic nature, not use telling us or other characters saying, "Oh, Galadriel, commander of the Northern armies." Okay, but when we're alone with her, we know something different. Okay, so let's go up because I've spoken quite a lot. So Lobster says, I think that Harry is a good hero, but not a good protagonist. You're going to have to explain that one, because uh, I'm lost. Yeah, I don't. What do you mean a good hero, but not a good protagonist? I know that a hero and a protagonist aren't the same thing, but I don't think you can be a good hero without being a good protagonist. I think you can be a protagonist of a story and yet not be heroic, but I don't think you can be a good hero and yet not a good protagonist. I don't. You're gonna have to explain that to me. Arachma says, Lobster, Harry is the chosen one archetype and works great in book one. Arguably not that well in the following books. Harry being the chosen one. I think I would have to disagree there, because Harry being the chosen one, let me just say this. I have a big problem with casting children as warriors, or heroes that have to take on the problem of adults. I generally just dislike this trope. That's just me. I do not find it believable. I don't like it. I don't think it makes for the best stories. I find it hard to believe when the adults in the room are just lost and the child walks in and is manages to crack the nuclear codes. That just generally ticks me off. So And my gripe with Harry Potter as an adult is seeing a whole nation push their issues on a child. A whole nation rely on a child to fight this grown man. That's my gripe with the Harry Potter universe. But then again, I know that it is a children's book. It's not meant for adult readers. Yes, it got popular and successful, and adults grew up with it and showed their kids, and we never grew out of it. I know that's great. I know that adult readers engage with it, but I've had this discussion many times. You're not the primary audience as an adult. So the gripe I have with a child um being the one to defeat the Lord and literally being 17 when he does it, yeah, I can have that gripe, but I also understand I'm not the target audience. It's for kids. It's for children who are in that age group. So it's going to have main characters in that age group. Now, putting that aside, for the chosen one archetype, I believe still works even in the other books because it does not mean that other characters can't fight Voldemort. It ultimately means that other characters literally cannot be the one to take him down. And J.K. Rowling sustains that by having Harry be a Horcrux. So Harry literally becomes a living vessel for Voldemort, a piece of Voldemort's soul, and that has been in him since he was a baby. Literally meaning that in no scenario, anywhere at any time, could anyone else have defeated Voldemort. Meaning no one else but Harry could have done this. And so the chosen one archetype is literally the thing that holds the entire story together. Because at no point could you have separated Harry from Voldemort. Harry had to be the one to kill Voldemort. And so the chosen one archetype remains the same. It remains the same throughout all of the other books, and it still works because it's literally the glue holding two main characters together. And it's the thing that makes them quite literally two sides of the same coin. So I don't know why you would say that it doesn't work. I'm interested to find that out, why you think it doesn't work as well in the later books. But I think it's fundamental to the very structure of the book. So there's no way that it couldn't work. Maybe you're saying that the execution wasn't great, which that's debatable. And I actually, in some cases, I actually would agree. But as a struct, it depends what you're sort of targeting that criticism at. Is it structure where the chosen one archetype just structurally doesn't work in later books, or is it the execution of that archetype doesn't work in later books as well as it does in book one? Let's see. Aragorn says, yes, it can always get worse. Trust me. And he says, we must talk about bread. Christopher says, the talk about separation of creator and work is also a problem with this work. The showrunners want people who disagree with them to like their show, but then disparage the audience. Yes, I agree that that comes into play, especially with the marketing element. We saw most of the bashing occur with the marketing. I have seen people's YouTube titles. Like I said, I stayed away from a lot of the commentary on this show. So I've seen people's YouTube titles about the show and about what the showrunners are doing and about the marketing and how Amazon is hitting back at the fans and all the sort of um hyperbolic titles that people use and the hyped up uh, things that people say in order to get a reaction out of the audience to click on their video. I've seen a lot of that, a lot of those things. And then usually what I find is that when you actually click on the video, they said something like, well, some people dislike this and we think that they haven't given it a chance. And then the YouTube creator goes, oh my God, look at how they're insulting the fans. That sometimes that can be how it is. And I find that personally hilarious because it's a fair thing to say. Not what the YouTube creator is saying, but what Amazon would say in that hypothetical scenario. But in other times, yes, some people, um sometimes the Amazon does actually hit back at the fans by calling them racist, by saying things that aren't justified, or not actually responding to some of the things that have been said by the fans with integrity. They don't respond to these things properly, and they just throw words out because, again, that's what gets the clicks. It's what makes the show interesting. Now, if the show actually had a promising storyline that was executed properly, then they wouldn't need all of this. But I think one thing people don't realize is that sometimes it's not that they actually think the fans are racist. They just need the buzz. They need people to just be shouting on Twitter and arguing so that there can be some interest around this. And also, if you can call the fans racist, to people who aren't fans of the show, who hear that message, it's almost like a signal of, well, if they're just saying it's bad for just because it doesn't resemble what they want, they give the show a chance. And a lot of things occur to try and make people watch this show, and a lot of the fans' reactions actually get manipulated so that they can entice people to watch the show, or that they can quieten some of the critique that is levied against them. Because for the vast majority of people that aren't keen fans, hearing the accusation of racism, bearing in mind the context of the time, we've had people actually make racist remarks regarding The Little Mermaid, which is coming out. We've had people make racist remarks regarding the when people were comparing one of the actresses from the Ghostbusters movie to a gorilla, or the Star Wars racial replacement, the Rise of Skywalker, one of those where they had a black character in there and people made racist remarks there. So when they accuse the fans of Lord of the Rings of racism, remember the context that we're in. So it's not just they're doing this in a vacuum. They know that if they levy these accusations against the fans, it's going to have some validity given the context of how fans of other fandoms have reacted before. Not to say that every fan in those fandoms has been racist, but the loudest ones, the airheads who have just made noise and who most likely don't even care about the work anyway, have been the racist and inflammatory commentary ones. So it's difficult for it's sort of difficult for us as fans to talk about the show without being labeled as that. And that's why I think having discussions such as this where we're moving away from the surface things and we're talking more about the integrity of the writing are very important, because it's very difficult to take this out of context. I'm sure someone will eventually, but it's very difficult to take a conversation like this out of context. Whereas a title, you know, warping the faces of the minority actors and actresses of a particular show to look disturbing, and just plastering woke on it. Yeah, that gets clicks, but think about the larger picture and the context that you exist in. How does this look to somebody who isn't a fan, to someone who doesn't know the context of your outrage, to someone who is just looking at this? Do you really think that they're going to imagine that you aren't a racist, or that you aren't feeding into this idea of the racist Tolkien Puritan fan? But when we don't think about these things, we actually feed into that negative press. And what we have to say, which is most times incredibly valid, goes unheard. So, Lobster says the Hateful Eight, it sounds like. Aragma says you can employ a phrase here. A small line starts there, but just as a homage. I think that's referring to the sort of presentation of Galadriel and the fact that certain characters look at her in awe and things like that. Yes, a throwaway line by certain characters would be great, but overall, you need the action to show us who you want your character to be. You can't have other characters just say things about them. So Lobster says middle class in America is much less posh um, than I think you're saying England or middle class in England is, so in America is much less posh than in the UK, I think you meant to say. I'm American, so that does warp my perspective. Um, yeah, I mean the class system varies. Uh, just given the history of both places. England is very much classist, whereas America um, has its own unique issues and a history that it has to contend with. Whereas England has an older history an older European history, not to discard the Native American history that came before the Europeans, but in terms of our European understanding of America, England has a longer and older history than modern America and modern America's uh, setup of how we come to know it today. So they have different uh, systems, and class is the system of Britain. And so having a character like Hermione uh, be the main character, or like your second point says, Harry could still be the hero, but Hermione could be the perspective. That wouldn't work either because her perspective is intrinsically linked to her characterization. If you were to, if you were to tell your story, Lobster, but through my perspective, you would have a very different story. If you were to tell your story through your mother's perspective, you have a very different story. If you tell your story through your perspective, again, a massively different story. Because as much as I can try to be impartial, my opinion of certain things, which is informed by my characterization, is going to color the story. So there's no way in which my perspective doesn't make me the main character. Look at The Great Gatsby, for example. As much as we argue that Gatsby is the main character, the person telling us the story is actually the main character. Nick Carraway is the main character because we see things through his opinion, which means that as he's telling us things about different characters, we get a picture of who he is and how he thinks. And how can you know so the person we know the most is him because the whole story is framed through his eyes. He's an unreliable narrator. So perspective shapes the story. How can you have Hermione shape Harry Potter's story? It doesn't make sense. And the point still, I don't understand the point you were trying to make by having Hermione be the perspective. Why would you want Hermione? What's the artistic reason for having Hermione be the perspective of Harry Potter's story? What different opinion or side would she bring? Why would you make Hermione's voice take precedence over everything by having the story be told through her perspective, knowing that she is a middle class, privileged girl, knowing that she hasn't been through the struggles of Harry, knowing that we would be deprived of Harry's inner thoughts because there's no way Hermione could know them. So stylistically, I don't understand why you'd make that choice. What would it add to the plot? What would it bring to the story? Why would you make that choice? I'm curious to know. Lob says you bring up great points though. Harry is much less of a Mary Sue than people say. I don't believe he's a Mary Sue at all. So I think I think that if you having a competent character, this is the thing. Terms get thrown around so much, and they lose their meaning. Having a competent or powerful character does not make them a Mary Sue. Having a character who seems to have a natural knack for certain things, like Harry has a knack for flying, but remember, he literally only uses one spell, Expelliarmus for everything. That's not Mary Sue. That's a character with a crutch. So it's it's difficult to use that term to refer to Harry. So we have to be careful about the terms that we use, especially as people who may want to write or may want to discuss literature. You can't just rely on certain terms like Mary Sue. Okay, what does that mean? So if a character is competent in any way, they're a Mary Sue. No, a Mary Sue is a character like the live action Mulan. She never has to struggle for anything. She doesn't learn anything from her struggles. She's naturally born with everything that she needs to know. She doesn't have to go to any camp. In fact, the only reason she's at the training camp is to blend in with the rest of the us commoners. Whereas Harry struggles. He doesn't get things right. In fact, he's a very average student in most things in class, potions being the worst. He has to cheat his way through 6th year. This is not a Mary Sue in any sense of the word. This is a boy trying to live life and who's constantly being stopped from living by Voldemort and the fact that everyone seems to think he's the problem, he's the solution to their problems. So I don't think that term can apply to Harry. And even and what I like to do is sometimes switch the genders of the characters because I think the term Mary Sue has a specific context, being that the term Mary Sue was usually used towards female characters who just seem to be great at everything. And that was an overcompensation because they felt like in that particular context, women were seen as not being able to do anything. So what do? You create characters who are able to do everything easily to combat that perception of women not being able to do anything. And so even if Harry was a girl, I wouldn't think that he was a Mary, she or Harriet or whatever name you wanted to give female Harry would be a Mary Sue. She'd still be the sort of well-rounded, fleshed out, angsty teenage character that Harry is. Let's see. Aragna says, "Ah, suffering. Wait till you read about Boris and Kira." So Lobster says, "Harry's not the Mary Sue at all." Double A says, "Hello, my lady." Hello, Double A. He also adds, "Galadriel's twitching face really bothers me." I thought I was the only one that noticed that. Galadriel's little twitch. Um, I don't know whether I really noticed it a lot in this. I've noticed it a lot throughout the series so far, but episode 8. I don't know why I keep saying season 8. Episode 8. It was almost like everything about the series that was wrong just burst out at me. And her little twitching. Theoretically, I think that twitching is just to show her barely concealed rage, but it's just not working. It's not working in the way that I think they wanted it to work. And so yeah, it can be a little bit grating and at best it's a little bit humorous, that twitching that she does. Ragnar says, "No, Harry is not a Gary Sue, but some people wrongfully accuse him of being one since he is the chosen one." Can't speak today. Archetype. Um, yes, I can definitely see why that particular archetype it gets any character that has it being accused of being a Mary Sue, because the very premise of being a chosen one kind of assumes that everything you do will somehow lead to you being victorious. And so there's a question of, well, how high are the stakes really when you're destined to complete the mission anyway? And so that's why it's always a very difficult archetype to pull off. And I believe that's why in the 5th and sort of 6th book, J.K. Rowling introduces the idea that Harry was chosen by Voldemort and not some workings of fate, that there were two children that could possibly have been the chosen one, Harry and Neville. And Voldemort kind of just tossed a coin, not literally, but he just kind of picked that, oh, Potter is the one I will choose to kill. And so I think she tries to introduce that idea to raise the stakes so that we know that, well, Harry isn't destined by some higher power to succeed. There's still a chance that he might lose because the person who chose him was the villain through, I don't know, chance. Because the prophecy doesn't specify Harry Potter is the one that will kill you. It leaves room for Harry or Neville to have been the chosen one. So I think she deliberately tries to introduce that idea because when you bring when you bring archetypes that worked really well in mythology stories into the art form of the novel, you you have to deal with realism, which is the inherent sort of um playing field that the novel exists in. So it's it's then really difficult to properly execute that chosen one archetype, because in mythology it was very easy because the chosen one was generally like the son of a god, and so we knew that no matter what happens he's going to succeed. Yes, his lover or family or friend might die, but he's going to succeed. um and even if he dies at the end like Achilles, he's going to succeed in his task. So it worked really well there when the expectations were different, but when you bring that archetype into the novel, you do have to do a lot of maneuvering in order to make it believable for your modern audience. Double A asks, when's the stream that will be for discussing the Jackson films? Um, I'm trying to work out a software that will allow me to show my TV and show me at the same time. I'm not tech savvy in the slightest, but I have a few friends that are, so I'm asking them. Obviously, we're still young people, so we have things like education and stuff like that. So not everyone is just readily available for me to just drag out of their lives and bring into mine. But hopefully that will be sorted out soon, and I'll definitely put out an announcement when that's going to happen. So Aragma says it does work well. It's just not to my liking, that archetype. So, and you've clarified that it's the execution of that archetype that, yes, I think that there's more of a basis for that argument, that the execution, again, because execution is just writing, and how you communicate your structural um the structure of your story and everything, and how you communicate all the background information and the story itself to the reader. And so yes, that's where we get into the subjective realm of, well, did this work and didn't that work, and people's opinions. And I definitely think that there's room to argue that in some cases, especially when J.K. Rowling introduces the idea that the chosen one was kind of just left up to chance, that's when I think perhaps the execution is not as sharp. Because personally, I questioned that decision a little bit. Even though I understood it, I questioned whether it couldn't have been handled better and not glossed over as quickly as it was. Because we get that revelation that Neville could have also been the chosen one, and then it's sort of just glossed over and said, well, he wasn't, so let's move on with our day. And again, that's just what happens when you're writing a book. Not everything is going to be as sharp. And even though a whole team is used to produce a book, we're all humans. Some things are going to slip. Not everything is going to be as sharp. So generally, I just overlooked that because fundamentally and for the most part, most of it works. And which is why I'm a bit disappointed, still very disappointed with Rings of Power, because I'm not, at least I don't think I'm very difficult to please when it comes to creative works. I don't think that I'm that harsh of a critic. So I didn't really have a vested interest in this series failing. So for me to come out of this and still be like, but why did you make half of these decisions? Is disappointing, because I'm really not that hard to please, and even I'm disappointed. So I can just imagine people who were just clenching their fists as they watch this, how angry they are with this series. So what else? Double A says, "Can I make a YouTube banner for you? I'm a part-time graphic designer." Oh, I would be very interested in that. Double A, you can DM me. Uh, I'm probably just gonna quickly type in my Instagram handle into the chat. It's just MN MNN writes. That's my Instagram, and you can just DM me and we can talk about that. But great, thank you. So Double A says Mr. Utterson is the main character of Jekyll and Hyde rather than Jekyll or Hyde being the main character, gives the story a neutral perspective and creates a great mystery. Yes, I have read Jekyll and Hyde, so I see where you're coming from with that, but there is a reason why that is the case and why it wouldn't work for a story like Harry Potter. Remember, audience is a very important part of why we read a story. Now, like I was saying, I told a story a little bit earlier on about a child I used to tutor and why she liked Harry Potter. She liked Harry Potter specifically because we had an intimate look into Harry's suffering. Take that away, and the appeal to the target audience, who is a very emotional audience, remember, children, they're literally moved by any wind of doctrine. But children, you need to build an emotional bond and very quickly because children's attention spans are just non existent. So for you to build that emotional rapport, you've got to do it quickly and you've got to make it concrete and keep enforcing it. So to have that story be told through a different perspective and give us distance from the character, you're going to alienate your primary audience. You can't ask the writer to write for an adult audience when they're not trying to write for an adult audience. So certain things are not going to appeal to adults. You're just not the target audience. And so certain decisions that we as adults look at and go, well, that I don't like that. Why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. Again, it's not written for you. It's written for children. So like I was saying, the whole chosen one archetype thing, as adults, we look at it and we say, okay, but that doesn't work and that's not so sharply written. It's not written for people with keen eyes. It's written for kids. And this is, again, something I had to accept about YA fiction. I had to accept that maybe I've just outgrown it. I am technically in that bracket. I'm a young adult. However, the writing feels like it's written for people who just turned into teenagers. And so it's difficult for me to like it. And also, a lot of young adult fiction is poorly written. It it's just based on emotions. Give us the toxic romance. Give us the hot, angsty character. It doesn't matter if he's badly written. Just make him hot. Like we don't care. And that just doesn't appeal to me. I dislike it a lot. And so that's why I don't read YA fiction. I can't keep doing the same complaint again and again and again and saying, but that doesn't work and that's awful and that's horrible. You're not the target audience. You're not looking for a quick fix. You're not looking for a quick high and toxic romance. That's not you. So I don't read books like that because, again, I'll just complain and bash it. I'm not the person they're writing to. I'm not their buyer. And what I find with a lot of with people who tend to be adults who read Harry Potter or perhaps come to Harry Potter for the first time, or fans who haven't read Harry Potter in a long time and come back to it, is they start seeing all these things and they're like, but that doesn't make sense and that doesn't work. And I'm like, well, you liked it when you were a child because it was written for you then. And you're beginning to see things about it now because you're an adult. And I personally went through the very same thing when I came back to Harry Potter as an adult. And there were certain things I saw about it and I was like, why? And the main one that I found, the main issue I had with it, I've talked about here, which is the whole sending kids into battle thing. I dislike that a lot. I can't express and not sound angry on this channel how much I dislike the idea of making children your heroes in stories that are particularly violent. It's not that I don't think children can do things in stories, but the idea of children having more wisdom than the adults grates my nerves. But in particular, the whole idea of a child being forced to the front lines for the sake of the adults in the situation just ticks me off. But then again, when you're a child reading that, it makes you feel like, oh, I can do something. You see yourself in the main character. But as an adult, all I see is a whole nation of adults forcing a child to fight their battles. And again, perspective deals with that. Just like what we were talking about, making Hermione the perspective. Why would we do that, bearing in mind the target audience? It doesn't make sense from a structural point of view. Again, certain decisions that are made in a story, you can't just make them because, well, it sounds nice. What does this do to the story? Like we were saying with Rings of Power, these aesthetic shots of her running or riding down the beach are great to look at. But what does it do to the story? If we are just making decisions, for example, well, it would be nice to see things from Hermione's perspective. What is that doing to the story? Why are we doing that? What's the point? Double A says, so you hate the Karate Kid. I haven't watched the Karate Kid. I think the only one I watched was the Jaden Smith one with Jackie Chan. That's the only one I watched. I haven't watched the ones I've sort of been circling around. Um, I'm not even a big fan of those kind of movies. Like I think Rush Hour, when it comes to karate movies, Rush Hour is the movie that I would reference and say that, hey, that's my butt kicking kind of karate movie, Rush Hour. So that tells you how little I watch karate or that those kind of movies. So yeah, I can't say I hate the Karate Kid because I haven't watched it. But if it's in line with kids fighting the battles while the adults are just clueless and can't do anything and are just sitting there dumb, I'm like, okay, are we talking about the same kids that a bad grade can force into a meltdown? Are we talking about these same kids? But yeah, Double A says, "Well, wouldn't expect someone as intellectual as you to watch Rush Hour. That is a cult classic. Excuse me." I love Rush Hour. Not because it's a great story, it's just funny and it's just old. And so when I watch Rush Hour, I'm switching my brain off. There are some things you watch to switch your brain off. There's some things you watch not because they're great pieces of art, it's because you want to laugh. And also, the relationship between Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan is hilarious and it's just feel good. It's not supposed to be Gladiator, or it's not supposed to be something that I watch and I'm really invested in the storytelling. Just make me laugh. Double A says, I love comedies that wouldn't be made these days, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, Rush Hour definitely would never be made in this day and age. There is no way, because the amount of racial jokes that would not get a pass, the amount of sort of looking at women perhaps in a more sexualized way and looking at them as if they're only meant to be pretty objects, even though they're not, and they do play important roles, and they're sort of more than their looks. But a lot could be said or taken out of context in Rush Hour. So, but like Aragma says, these jokes made the movie fun. They did, and sometimes I just sit there and I just want to laugh. I just want Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker to just go on a journey together, and I don't really care what's happening or whether the story makes sense. Just make me laugh. Double A says that Chinese girl in Rush Hour 2 is intense AF. Oh yes, she is. She was so but Chris Tucker's interaction with her killed me when he's like, we could have made a great couple if you weren't crazy. That killed me. I honestly sometimes that movie pops into my head and I just start laughing. Sometimes I see clips of in Rush Hour 1 of the little girl singing in the car and the two sort of security guards or the two drivers sort of looking at each other. Oh, that scene still cracks me up. So the movie isn't supposed to make sense. It's just supposed to be a good laugh. And that's why, yes, even though I I am a little bit of an intellectual. I still like things that are trash. Trash movies. Sometimes they're just so trash that they're great. And Rush Hour wasn't pretentious. It knew it wasn't a serious movie. Yes, it had serious aspects of it. It had a story that we could follow, but really we're just there for Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan. That's what we're there for. And they gave us that. They knew what they were, and they gave it to us. So having Arachne says having a competent character does not make him or her a Mary Sue. For example, um, Alaric von Eng- Engelbert from the Star Shatter series, who is an elite star marine with decades of experience. I've had people calling him and other characters in the series Mary Sue's, even though it was clearly established early on who they were and how they earned their merit. Yeah, it the only time that I think people sort of say that others are Mary Sue's is if they never face struggle. They've got to struggle, and there have got to be times where we legitimately, as an audience, fear for them. If we don't, then you can establish that they made their way to the top and they earned this post. But yeah, the that's like Arondir looking at Galadriel and saying, "Wow, Galadriel, commander of the Northern armies." If we never see any of that, it doesn't matter. You might as well just you might as well not show us because you haven't shown us. You haven't shown us their struggle. You haven't shown us the come up. We have to see that history. I know a lot of writers are scared of things like flashbacks and stuff, but we've got to see it. If we don't see it, we don't believe it. And so this is why the starting in media res can be a little bit dangerous for those who aren't intending to ever go back to before the action began. When you start in media res, you start in the middle of the action, and immediately your reader is confused because we don't know what is happening. We're trying to gather information as quickly as possible. So whatever you do then, you can't just start in the middle of a census action that doesn't make sense. If you're starting in media res, that beginning has to be very important and has to actually be the crux of the story. So for example, in Rings of Power, us just looking for Sauron, when we compare the whole search of looking for Sauron to the important part of the entire series, which was never looking for Sauron, it was actually just the creation of the rings, which is the most important part. Us taking 7 episodes to get there is nonsensical. Make the search for Sauron short and sweet. Make it the flashback. Let us actually see Galadriel being a good person. Let's journey with Galadriel, and then let's get to her having to make hard decisions. Because when she does that, then we sympathize with her. We're not looking at her like, "Oh my god, this this woman." So yeah, show us their struggles and show us who they were before this. I can see your character here, but I want to know who they were before the struggle. And also, when you're writing, there's the 3-act structure. The primary way in which we write is the beginning, the middle, and the end. If you choose to start in the middle, remember that your beginning doesn't just disappear. It's got to be integrated somehow. Flashbacks is literally just the most generic example I can think of and the most prominent example I can think of. But we've got to see them before they became this person. Because remember, at the point that we meet your character in media res or in the beginning or the middle scene, we don't we're not privy to everything that made them. And so we're judging them as we see them. And if your character's being an a-hole to someone else, we don't care if they're the most benevolent person in the world. That's how we met them. And that's who they're going to be for the foreseeable future, unless you do some drastic work to make them someone else. So, as writers, as screenwriters, as people who are sort of looking at projects to write, we have to be very weary of how we present our characters and know that we, even if we start in the middle, the beginning doesn't cease to exist. We've got to integrate it into the story going forward. See. Double A says, who's the best hero out of Harry Potter? Frodo Baggins and Luke Skywalker. Well, Luke Skywalker is already starting off on a bad foot because I'm not a Star Wars fan in the slightest. I may be, I may become one day. I just don't know enough about it. I've never watched anything in its entirety. I've only seen clips or just caught it when it was on TV when I was young. It's I've never sat down and said, okay, let me explore this world. And so he's already starting on the back foot for me. No, I've read about other people talk about him in articles. So my what my knowledge of him is that he's a very sort of typical hero. Like he follows the hero's archetype quite well. Um I don't know if I can choose though between Harry Potter and Frodo Baggins because they come from two different stories and they're both good characters. For example, they're actually a little bit similar in many ways, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think J.K. Rowling's was aware of, she definitely would have been aware of Frodo, but I think that there are lots of similarities between them. The fact that both of them are very wary of putting people that they love in danger, often elect to go and do things by themselves. When you watch the films and when you actually read the books, that's when the similarities become clearer. Because in the films, well, you can say, well, they're both dark-haired, pale, small people, but in the books, where Frodo tends to take the more proactive part in the story than he does in the films. That's why I think the similarities between the two of them. And honestly, I couldn't pick which is the better hero because if there's one thing that J.K. Rowling did well, we can argue about whether everything that J.K. Rowling wrote was great, and I don't think she's as great as a writer as Tolkien by any stretch of the imagination. But one thing she did well was Harry's character. Every child that I've tutored, everyone that I've spoken to, if there's one thing that they can praise, it's Harry. If there's one thing that sort of makes them love the books, is that the whole fandom is united by its affection for Harry. And I don't think that's something that can be dismissed. I think that's something that's actually very profound. That she was in everything, she was able to get the audience connection to Harry right. So I actually don't know the answer to that question. Arachne says, when you write a chosen one archetype, it is always about the friends, love interest, family around them. This is how I, as an author, would raise the stakes, definitely. And I think J.K. Rowling was very aware of that, as Harry was always very reluctant to endanger anyone around him. And that was the majority of his angst, that he was a danger to the people around him and that he would get them all killed and he would lose everyone. So it's definitely always the people around them who raise the stakes for them. Do-do-do-do. Arago says, yes, I still remember how happy you were when the series was first announced. Um, this is directed at Double A. Arago says, I'm kind of torn. They're both quite similar archetypes and executed very well. I would say it's 50-50 for me, and I think this is a response to who is the better character. Double A says in reference to Rush Hour, the massage parlor scene was gold and very interesting for me to watch as a teenage boy. Uh, oh yes, that massage parlor scene was very interesting. Definitely gave me a different perspective on massage parlors. I love a good massage myself. Yeah, I've definitely never had a pretty Asian lady massage me. Um, it's usually been an older woman, but yeah, it was very interesting, that particular scene. And to one thing I love about Rush Hour is that our heroes always get beat up. They never have a straight victory. And so it added to the comedy of it, but it also added to the realism of Rush Hour. And that's one thing I loved about it. It wasn't just one fight and yay, they've won. The villains actually were villainous. They did things that was actually scary, and people could die. And that's something that I felt was really missing from Rings of Power. Is that as much as the stakes weren't high except for characters who weren't important. If you were a side character in Rings of Power, oh, it's a dangerous place to live in, because you're going to get caught on fire, you're going to lose limbs, you're going to die, your comrades will turn against you. But if you're a main character, you can stand in the middle of an coming ash storm straight out of a hot volcano and live. So there's no reason for me to fear for the characters. Lenny Henry dies in the eighth episode, and yeah, I guess that's some kind of consequence, but I knew it wasn't going to be extremely important moving forward. I kind of got the sense that he was going to croak at some point. But yeah, I don't think that the show has stakes as much as it's trying to portray that it has stakes. There's a lot of talk about, oh, the elves will have to leave forever. Okay, but of what consequence is that? So you guys get to go to Valinor and leave the war torn, um, always in conflict, bad memories, and literally half of your city is just trees with dead people carved into them, and you get to wash that all away in Valinor. Like, okay, then what's the stakes? It sounds like a pretty good deal to me. So the stakes aren't as high as they're trying to portray, and I think, again, that's like I've been harping on about this entire live stream, a writing issue. Okay, so Arachne says, struggle, yes. One of the main themes in my book series is hunger, thirst, and overcoming them. I have been criticized writing about that too, believe it or not. Wow, who would criticize you for writing about hunger? It's something that we all feel, so that critique doesn't make sense. Maybe it's the critique is more about the execution of how um these themes are sort of tackled, because I don't see, again, like I was saying, structurally, I don't think you can criticize the idea of people going through it, hunger and pain and grief, but you can perhaps criticize the execution of these things. Oracle says Galadriel barely bled. She didn't even sweat. Oh yes. When that cloud of ash hit her, I expected the armor on her to burn her to cinders, but she stood up, not even a mark, despite the fact other people were literally on fire. Um, I don't understand why they made that decision to just have Galadriel unharmed. But again, yeah, I can't. I've really done a lot of justifying for this show, I feel. And I can't even justify that, even with the internal logic of the show, because it defied its own internal logic. So yeah, I don't understand why. Let's see. Double A says Luke Skywalker is the GOAT hero. I can't disagree or agree with that, because again, like I said, I don't know him that well. Um Double A says, do you think there's a place for sexual themes in literature with religious undertones? Oh, Jesus Christ. Well, yes. Yes, I do. I do think there is a place for um yes, I do. Because in the I can okay, let me let me balance myself and just answer this. in the Christian faith, because that's the only one I have a very intimate knowledge of, sex isn't something that is prohibited in okay, it's prohibited in a particular context, but sex inherently is not a negative thing. It's not a bad thing. In fact, there's a whole book in the Bible that just talks about it openly. There are several other places beside the Song of Solomon that talk about sex. It's not a bad thing. The taboo around it is largely because of the misuse of it and just because as humans we don't like we just act in a way that we can't have good things. So um yes, there's definitely a place for sexual themes in a work of religious undertones, because I don't think you can, especially not if your religious undertones are in any way Christian, you can't separate it from it. There are whole illustrations, sexual illustrations in the Bible that are used not just to describe a relationship between men and women, but also, in a way, our relationship with Christ. Now, before we warp that out of proportion, it's just supposed to describe the complete love that exists between followers of Christ and Christ. So, sex inherently is not a bad thing. It's about execution. Again, you can't just it's a way of talking about sex, it's a way of talking about intimacy in a work with religious undertones, um and I don't think you can separate the two, but the way that you execute both of them will largely determine whether it's tasteful or distasteful. So yeah, that's my answer to that. Double A says, nobody makes me bleed my own blood. Nobody. That's in reference to Galadriel not bleeding at all when the large cloud of dust, of ash, of hot ash and dust hit her in the face and caused her to topple over. But apparently, it was not enough. It was just a light wind that caused her to topple over, but not enough to cause one single burn. It just covered her in ash, but not one burn. No, sorry. Um, Aragorn says they said it wasn't realistic at all. Apparently, the people who criticize me have never experienced any hardship at all. I usually find that is the case. People who have never gone through any sort of real struggle are usually the first to criticize uh, portrayals of struggle. It's always the people who have never gone to war who always like to say, back in the day. It's like, okay, you are on your Xbox in your mother's basement. Stop. Like, there it's always the people who've never struggled, who have an expectation of other people. It's like, oh, men should be providers, but don't have a job. It's like you offer nothing, but you're expecting somebody's son to just rescue you out of the poverty. It's a lot. There are people who always criticize with no expectation on themselves and all the expectation on other people. That being said, whenever you receive a critique, it's always good to search for whether there's any validity in it or any advice that you can take from it. But if it's just rubbish, then discard it. At the end of the day, people's opinions cannot dispute fact. It is a fact that when people are hungry, they do very drastic things, make very drastic decisions, make very desperate decisions. If you're able to portray the facts about deprivation and about extreme thirst and hunger, then there's nothing to criticize. It's a fact that when human bodies are pushed to this extent, this is what they do. And so if you're able to portray facts, then um, the critique can only be levied against your presentation of those facts. Um, no, I am not that active on Twitter. It's more Instagram. Um, yeah, I know I should probably get active on Twitter, but yeah, Twitter is just a lot. Twitter is much. So so I find it very difficult to engage on Twitter, also because as this stream has proven, I like to talk a lot. So Twitter's restrictive format isn't ideal, but I probably should still utilize the platform, and I'll make a note of it and put it on my to-do list. Arachne says you cannot hurt Galadriel because she is max level. A volcanic eruption is nothing for her since she has a lot of hit points. That would work in a video game, but unfortunately, that doesn't work in a series. Double A says, can you remember a single memorable line from Rings of Power? I cannot, but for the Jackson trilogy, I could fill a book with quotes just off the top of my head. That is true. The only sort of memorable lines are the ones that were from Rings of Power are the ones that were so stupid that I find myself thinking, wait, why would you do that? The other, the line being when Galadriel asks her brother Finrod, um, how will I know the difference between the lights in the sky and the lights in the water? My answer would have been because the water has ripples, so you would know which one you're looking at. But his answer is sometimes you have to touch the darkness. No, because the logic of that does not hold. And the show does a lot of things like this, where when in this current episode that we have available, episode 8, Galadriel's talking to Elrond and they're talking about past mistakes and I'll never make the mistake of not trusting you again. And she says, and he asks Galadriel, what do we do? And she says, just like as if she's Dory, swim. The only thing we can do, swim. And in my head, I was like, just keep swimming. You're not Dory. And this isn't Finding Nemo. This is the fate of Middle Earth. Could you be more profound? Could you say something more encouraging than just swim? Just swim is literal complacency. Just swim means let's just get through this. Get through what? But the show does this a lot, where it just says things that are supposed to sound profound, but are not, and don't make sense. And the logic of them don't make sense. Of the logic of them doesn't make sense. Wow, you can tell I'm tired. So Arachne says, I have a tempest in me is probably one of the best memorable lines from Rings of Power. Yes, that line has become very popular because the way Galadriel delivered that line was just so unnecessary. Um, with the revelation that Halbrand is Sauron, his little eye roll when she said that, and him just going, "Ugh," it makes it so much funnier. It makes that scene so much funnier because Sauron, the literal bad guy of the series, is hearing you sprout this and going, "Oh my god, Galadriel, stop!" So, in that, with the revelation that he is Sauron, that scene suddenly just becomes an absolute joke. It becomes so much funnier because Sauron, the bad guy, the lieutenant of Morgoth, is giving you a lesson in tact. That's how you know that you've fallen off, sis. You've fallen off. And this is why he thought he could convince her to join his side. Because this is how he's become acquainted with her. She's just over the top, emotional. So what he does is appeal to her emotions. That works within the logic of the show, but the execution of how he invades her memories, the execution of that whole flashback or thought invasion scene, it was so confusing, and I didn't understand the logistics of how Sauron could escape Lindon, the capital city, in the context of the series, the capital city, the residence of the High King, without being spotted. No one knows where he is. He just disappeared. The person who was integral to the forging of these rings, because he was one sort of communing with Celebrimbor, he just vanished and nobody asked questions. We glossed over that. Okay. But decisions like that are what this show make and confuse everybody watching it. Aragma says Galadriel acted and spoke like a petulant child. Yes, I don't know why I sounded like a British newscaster then, but yes, she did. And again, her characterization was questionable. Even within the context of the story, where they're trying to show her as this as a character that isn't very wise and still in the heat of battle and isn't really sure on how to transition. I just wish they would have given us more to like about her. I honestly, and this might be a bit problematic to the fans, but I probably would have given Galadriel more of a chance, this Galadriel more of a chance, if we had just balanced her out a bit and made her more likable. Because I already knew that this show was going to deviate quite a bit from Tolkien's vision. So if they had just made Galadriel a character that I could go, well, you're not the one I like, but I like you ish. I can get behind you as this separate entity and character with the name of the one I like. Then okay, I would have been able to give this show more of a chance and be able perhaps to forgive certain deviations from Tolkien's work. But they haven't even helped themselves because Galadriel isn't likable. I mean, I see them trying. I see them trying with her relationship with Elrond, with the budding relationship that she had with Halbrand, with the sort of tat that she went about confronting the situation about him not being who he says he is. She didn't just walk up to him and rage and be like, "Tell me who you are." That was the Galadriel that probably would have made that decision earlier on, because that's basically what she did in Numenor. So I applaud that little bit of characterization, of character growth, where she confronts him secretly ish, where she confronts him in a mature and tactful way. She doesn't just head on stab him and demand to know what he's doing here, or do something that would be like, yep, that's Galadriel from Numenor. She acted in a way that was a bit more sensible from what we've seen of this particular Galadriel. So that was a bit of a relief, because I honestly thought the moment she finds out, she's just going to chop his head off and he's going to have to turn into smoke and evaporate away, and something really cringy and very stupid like that. But they handled it better and than I expected, and yet his escape didn't really make sense. But okay, at least they gave us a Galadriel in episode 8 who wasn't completely bonkers and brash. So yeah, and she was able to give up that damn knife. Oh my god, I was so happy when that thing melted. I was like, yes, finally, because with the dagger melting, I hope it begins an era of Galadriel not fighting with a sword. I don't want to see her just kicking people's butts with a sword. Sit down and use your magic. I hope it's the beginning of a new type of Galadriel in season 2. I hope that's what the melting of that sword means, because she took so long to give that sword up. And I hope they didn't just show us an extra long shot for no reason, because this show is fond of doing that, giving us long shots that never become anything. I hope it focused on her giving up the sword her brother's dagger, I hope it does something. I hope it does something to her. I hope it marks the beginning of a softer, wiser Galadriel. I hope that this encounter with Sauron has shaken her enough to realize that, look, I'm actually dangerous and I actually need to sit down and go to Lothlorien and figure myself out. I hope that's where we're going. And hopefully there we'll find Celeborn and start something and have a child. I hope that's what we're planning for our beloved Galadriel. So I'm just going to answer the last few questions and then end this stream because I've been talking for 2 hours. Okay. Double A says, I'm watching this as I wash the dishes, so please entertain me so the time goes faster. Okay, so this stream isn't ending soon then. Let me know when you finish with the dishes. But I really like that image. I'm not gonna lie. You listening to me while you're washing the dishes. I actually quite like that image because I do that a lot. When I'm doing chores, I just turn on somebody that I one of the YouTubers I listen to when I just listen to them in the background as I'm cleaning. So yeah, I kind of like that somebody's doing that with my with my video. So let's see. Aragma says the writer's inner obnoxiousness shone in Galadriel's eyes. Yeah, we could put that down to the writer's own sort of pride, or it could just literally be who they were trying to make Galadriel. Because again, Galadriel is not the only character, and most of the other characters, even the female ones, are actually Muriel annoys me a little bit. It's like you're blind. Be humble. That sounds like a really horrible thing to say, but you are blind. It's time to rethink your throne. It's time to rethink. You shouldn't even be thinking about anything other than what you're going to say to your kingdom to justify the why you went being able to see and you came back with a dishcloth over your face. Like you need to sit down and stop talking to people about how they're coping with their kids, even though I liked that little bit of interaction between Elendil and Muriel in the lower part of the ship when they were talking about how he was coping with his loss and fighting and making sure that everything that they've lost is actually worth it in the end. I liked that little bit. But still, I would have liked a plan to hear a plan on what was going to happen once we get back. Is she just going to walk around with a cloth over her face? We need to know what's happening because the queen going blind isn't a small thing. This could mean a declaration of war on Middle Earth. It's a big thing. Your monarch has gone blind. Imagine if someone shot the queen. The queen's dead, and this may seem like a horrible thing to say, but let's just use a monarch. Let's just use a monarch, not the queen, but let's just use a monarch. A monarch got shot in the eyes, and now they can't see. The First World War was started because one prince got shot or attacked, or one prince died in a country, and everyone had to go to war because one prince died in some country. Imagine shooting a monarch in the eyes. That will lead to some reparations. It will lead to some sort of um conflict. And I can see um the other male character, the sort of, I can see her cousin capitalizing on the facts that their queen has gone and come back blind and using that as an excuse to go to war or to seek tribute from Middle Earth or put Middle Earth in their debt. I can see that happening. So I think it's very important that the writers understand thoroughly all the consequences to the decisions that they've made within the story. If you're going to have Muriel go blind permanently, that definitely means she's going to be usurped because there's no way a blind woman is keeping her place on the throne. I don't care if she's as strong willed as Diana, the goddess of the hunting herself. She is not keeping that throne. So we already know that's a direct consequence. And if she keeps that throne, I don't I don't even think I will be able to explain away that particular change, that particular action. So we know she's going to lose her throne because it's the only thing that makes sense. We know that it will probably be used as an excuse to attack, gain tribute, or have some kind of alliance or something that will lead the Numenorians back to Middle Earth. So this already, just the Queen's blindness already has two major consequences. And what I'm seeing from the series so far is that it will make certain decisions within the story, but it hasn't really gotten a grasp on how to deal with those consequences or how to write them with the significance that they need. And I hope that that problem does not persist into season 2, because for the people who will continue to torture themselves and watch season 2, or then yeah, I think that they have to remedy those problems going forward, or season 3 may not be a thing. So let's see. Aragma says another writer would have at least tried to mellow her character a bit, make her more of an adult, thoughtful about the consequences of her actions. Yes, I definitely think a better writer would have done that. But they are not better writers, as we've come to learn in these 8 episodes. I just hope that going forward, new writers will be brought on. I hope that going forward, changes will be made, because I know that they have a bunch of scenes they haven't used. So rejiggle some stuff, do something, give us some flashbacks, let us see a world without the current conflict. We could have had, imagine how much better the series would have been if every single scene featuring the Harfoots was discarded and instead we went back to Valinor. We saw Galadriel in a better light. We saw the world before. We saw how the conflict unfolded. We saw how things got to this state. So discard and the Harfoots are in quite a lot of scenes. So discard every single Harfoot scene and just give us flashback. Imagine the series now. And I want you guys to tell me in the chat how would you receive the series if every single scene featuring Harfoots was replaced with a flashback to Valinor, or a flashback to a specific scene in Galadriel's life before she became Galadriel. So nice Galadriel, pretty Galadriel, dancing and seducing Celeborn Galadriel. How much better would it have been? So let's see. Double A says, this may sound harsh, but the Galadriel actress is nowhere near as pretty to play her, especially compared to Cate Blanchett. I mean, I definitely think she has an elvish look about her. And I think if she was taller, I wouldn't have an issue with her looks. Me personally. I think Cate Blanchett is a pretty woman. And I think that she has a more ethereal face whereas Miss Clark has a more impish face. She has a nose that's slightly upturned. She has more pointed features than rounded features. So I think that while Cate Blanchett definitely looks ethereal and elvish, but she looks elvish in a way that I would imagine that was perfect for what Tolkien was trying to portray. Whereas Lauren Clark has an impish face. It's still elven, but a different type of aesthetic. It's more sharp, and her face lacks the softness that marked Kate Blanchett's face. And that's the marked difference. It's not that I think she's less pretty, I just think her face is different. Double A. That comment. So Double A says, Miss Clark looks like a goblin. They missed an opportunity with casting her as one. I firmly disagree with that one. You cannot get me into that camp. Hell no. I definitely disagree with that one. I do not think she looks like a goblin. I don't think she looks like a goblin. There are so many scenes in which I actually think she's quite pretty. It's just she just looks angry half the time. And so it's really difficult to see her as anything other than this angry little woman. She's also short. That's actually look, her face, I don't mind. It's her height that I have a problem with. I say this as someone who is 5'4". I don't I don't care about height in real life, but if you're going to give me a character who is supposed to present this authority figure, they can't be my height. I'm sorry. Not in fantasy. You can be my height and rule the world. Yeah, definitely. But not in a fantasy series and you're a mythological elf. As a human, fair enough. Look at Napoleon. And I definitely have that complex. But still, you in a mythological series where you're supposed to be sort of the best of the best because you were born and raised basically in Valinor. I'm not expecting you to be my height. That the light of the trees needed to speed grow you up into a 7 foot or at least a 6 foot something person. Her height is my issue. It's not her face. She's not imposing. And I think that's the main problem. I get like they were never going to get another Kate Blanchett. So I wasn't expecting someone who looked exactly like her anyway. I just wanted somebody who had a face that could match that elven aesthetic. I do think that if we had to get into her face, some of her features are a little bit sharp and they could have softened her up a little bit, especially by softening her expression, please. But her height is the biggest issue. It's not her face. I don't think she's an ugly woman, and I don't think she looks like a goblin. I just think she's too short. Miranda Otto is 10 times prettier than Miss Clark. Mm, that's an opinion. Personally, the actress who played Eowyn, I already really found her attractive as she got older. I don't watching the movies, maybe I don't know what it is about her face. I just didn't find her that attractive. She just yeah. I don't find her that attractive. So yeah. And that's what Arachne says. Height could be fixed with a box, camera work and lights, etc. And that is what I've been saying in my other live streams. The actress herself doesn't have to be tall. You can make her tall by using lighting, by using boxes, as Arachne has says. She doesn't need to actually be tall. And so this is a problem I have with the series. You are spending so much money, but very simple things are not being done. It's not going to take that much effort to make her tall in every scene that she's in. At least make her as tall as Halbrand. Don't have that scene where they're both looking in the water, in episode 8, where they're both looking in the water and she's a lot shorter than him and he's the Dark Lord. I wouldn't be convinced by that. I'd be like, well, first of all, um, even if you wanted me to be your queen, why am I this shorter than you? Could you not at least like make me taller in the vision? So just the imbalance of height wouldn't be convincing, and no wonder it didn't work. You should have made her taller. I just feel like having her stand on Galadriel's height is deliberately mentioned in the books because it's not just for us to see her as, oh wow, tall woman. It's imposing. Aragorn says, remember how they made John Rhys Davies as Gimli short? It was great camera work and acting. Exactly. I doubt that Durin is that short. But when he walks next to Elrond, he appears short. It's not that difficult to do. Again, they wrote in a Galadriel that just didn't make sense. Double A says that was a double Ragnar. Yes, but there are scenes where we see his face and we see the height difference. So for example, what Ragnar's referring to with camera work, any scene in which John Rhys Davies is talking to another character, he's looking up at the camera. So we get the impression that the character he's speaking to is looking down. And the same goes for the other actors when they're speaking to him. And so it makes sense that we as the audience view him as shorter because even the camera angles are enforcing our perception of his height. Even though the John Rhys Davies is the tallest member of the cast, but we don't get a sense of that because they actually cared about presenting these characters well. Let me just scroll back up because I missed some stuff. Okay. Double A asks, do you watch The Crown? I used to back in the day when I had time. What days those were? But yes, I watched The Crown and I really enjoyed it. I watched it with my family, as I do most things. Um, I ended up stopping, not because it wasn't interesting, just because my time was taken up by other things. It's definitely something that if I had more time, I would love to watch because I've really enjoyed it while I was watching it. And yeah, any fans of The Crown, if you would like to hear about it, please say you would because that would give me an excuse to watch it. um, but yeah, if really the only time I have time to sort of watch things is when someone requests a video, then I'm like, okay, I have to watch it now and I have to make time for it. Otherwise, I'm like, okay, I have all this work to get done and I don't have time to watch things for pleasure. But yeah, that's my life, guys. Um, Double A says, I would prefer flashbacks, but still they wouldn't execute them right. It is true, but it would be remarkably better if they spent all the time that they spent on the Harfoots in flashbacks, because that would build the story that they are telling. Whereas the Harfoots sort of take away from that story because it's not important to the plot. Gandalf doesn't become important to the plot until well into the Third Age. So I don't understand why we're focusing so much time on Gandalf and his adventures with the Harfoots. I honestly hoped that he would leave Nori behind and go by himself, and so we would see the end of the Harfoots once and for all. They would end in season 1. But no, Nori is going with Gandalf, and so we will definitely see the Harfoots again. Aragorn says, Kate Blanchett has a gentle smile. Yes, she does. I love her as an actress, but I also think that we can't keep using her as sort of the benchmark for every single person who plays this role. And I don't say that in like a mean-spirited way. I just mean that from what I've seen, Kate Blanchett is Kate Blanchett, and I don't there'll never be another actress who will give quite what she gave to that character. But the reason why I dislike this Galadriel is because I was willing to accept that she would be slightly different, that there would be a different flair given to her just because of the cleanness of the scenes that we saw in the trailer, it was going to be a different sort of Galadriel. It wasn't going to be a Galadriel crowned with silver light. It wasn't going to have that sort of hazy aesthetic that we see in the Peter Jackson movies. It was going to have a more like clean, high fantasy, almost video game like look to it. And so I accepted that we might have a different Galadriel, but I expected her to have the same sort of essence, that she was going to be a wise character. She was going to be a gentle and loving character, not a aggressive, power hungry. Well, not power hungry in a sense, but just aggressive, temperamental with the whole tempest in me thing. I didn't expect that. And so it was yeah, it was a disappointment, and I just hope that there is a big turnaround coming for her. And I was encouraged by the fact that she was able to let go of her brother's knife, which I think is a good signal that we will see a Galadriel who is softer, and see a Galadriel who is capable of building close relationships like what we see between her and Elrond. Um, Hi Callum. Callum says, "Halbrand was Sauron." Gasp! I know. Um, yeah, I'm interested to see how they do that. To my knowledge, Sauron is supposed to be beautiful. I'm not saying that the actor who plays Halbrand is ugly, but I wouldn't call him beautiful. So, they've really decided to go for a very different sort of thing here. When it comes to the characters, they've really turned them on their head, because that is not how I expected Sauron to be. I didn't expect him to be a very plain sort of person. He has the height, which is great. As we've been complaining about Galadriel's height, he has the height, which is a plus. But yeah, I'm curious to see how he plays it. And I personally think that the actor who plays Halbrand is going to have a fun time playing Sauron, if that evil smirk at the end is anything to go by. I kind of like the shot with the orange volcano panning to Halbrand's eyes and then going outward. It's kind of like a foreshadowing little bit. It's a nice little shot. This series, as much as I criticize it, has lots of nice little aesthetically pleasing shots. My problem is that half of them don't mean anything, and half of them are just there to be there, which is a problem with storytelling. Michael Rosa, hi Michael, says, "I think her ears are too short. Most of the time they disappear behind her hair. That make her look too similar to the humans around her. Definitely another problem I agree with. If you're going to have an elf, I want them to obviously be an elf. I don't want them to be able to pass for a human. And that's another problem I have with this series, is that the humans and the elves are really not distinguishable. Yeah, that's except maybe Gil-galad. I think he looks like what I wanted the elves to look like. And it's such a shame that they're just teasing us with characters who you're like, okay, that looks right. And then other characters that don't look right and look horrible, like Elrond's hair. Give my guys some long hair, please. I can't stand the fact that they have long hair, that they don't have long hair. And I can't stand the fact that Celebrimbor is old. Look, I know I said in the last live stream that I'd made my peace with it, but it still comes up. It still comes up, and I just don't like it. I'm trying to make myself like it, but I'm not stomaching it, because every time I see Gil-galad, I'm reminded of what could have been with Elrond's hair, and it's just a. But it's relatively small. It's relatively small, so it's not that big. It is. It's a big deal, because the aesthetic matters. The aesthetic matters. It's not something that can easily be tossed aside. But for the sake of just moving on to things that I think can be fixed and actually implemented into the show, I won't focus on the hair. Callum says it's not simple to just find time to binge through Netflix shows. That is very, very true. That's unfortunately one of the things they don't tell you as an adult. When you were a child, you thought that you would just have time to do everything. And then you become an adult and you realize you don't have time to do any of the things you can now afford to do. It's an absolute scam. When you're a child, you have all the time but no money. And when you're an adult, you have money but no time. And sometimes, as an adult, you don't even have either of them, which is just the joke. That's the punchline. Sometimes you don't have either. Okay. Double A says, I only watched season 4 of The Crown for obvious reasons because of a certain character. Oh, Diana. It's a good reason to watch that. Just a quick side note. The media's obsession with Diana is hilarious to me because while she was alive, the media is the reason why she was hounded so much. The media is the very thing that ended up killing her, essentially. They hounded her to her death. But now every magazine, every article is just praising Diana like she's some kind of living goddess. It's always amused me how fickle British media is, and media in general, to be honest. Arachma says my bread is in the oven. I will post on Insta and tag you later. Please do. I would like to see your results. I did give a whole analogy for those who weren't here, but I gave a whole analogy about execution and how it's like baking. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that bread. Thank you very much, Arakma. Neutron Ball. Hi, Neutron. I find Nori Brandyfoot very likable as a character. I like her. I'm not actually against her as a character. I just think that she didn't need to exist. Which sounds like I hate her, I know. But you see, the thing is, even in my own writing, I have characters I absolutely love, but they don't need to be there. And a general rule with writing, if a character does not need to be there, cut them out. They don't need to be there. So I personally think that she is a well written, likable character that people could have rallied behind. But for the story that is being written, she's not important. Cut her out of the story. I don't need to see her. What I need to see is the backstory of the characters that you are showing us to be at the very forefront, but have made so unlikable that I don't care about them. That's what I need to see. I need to see you showing us flashbacks. I need to see you taking us to a time where I could possibly like this character. In the first episode, you showed me Child Galadriel being isolated from all the other children, showing me that she's a loner. Then you showed me a scene of her making a boat that could float. And then you showed me a scene of her beating up the other children. Like, I don't get how I'm supposed to go, oh, what a dear child. I'm definitely rooting for this one. That's how you introduced your main character to me. But because the show is pulled in so many directions, it doesn't know how to focus in and actually take us on a journey with a character that actually is important. And so we get the journey with the Brandyfoots. What role do the Brandyfoots have in the Second Age? But again, writing choices that aren't great. Right, let's go up because I've missed another few. Michael said, what do you think about the lack of elven magic in the show? Was it okay for you? Would you prefer they displayed more supernatural powers or abilities? Um, that's actually a really good point. Yeah, I think I've brought it up once with Galadriel, how I would have preferred for her to have powers that were more supernatural than physical. And again, if they do that, but if they do bring um supernatural powers into the show, I don't want them to be too flashy. I want them to sort of toe the line, like what they've done with um Gandalf so far, but I would prefer it to be a little bit more dialed back than what we've seen so far. Um, but yeah, that's kind of my thought on supernatural powers and magic in Middle Earth. I want to see it, but I also want to see it dialed back a bit. Okay, let's see. Wow, I've been talking for a long time. Arachne says, well, they laundered the money, so more special effects weren't in their budget. I can't confirm that, so I can't comment on that one. Callum says the Shadow of Mordor had a vastly more beautiful depiction of Sauron. Yes, it did. I've actually watched someone play that game. I'm not a gamer myself. I honestly believe that I will never will be. So as close as I get to games is watching other people play them. Um, and I can only do that in short bursts because my god, is it boring. um, but yeah, I do think the overall storyline of Shadow of Mordor um is very interesting, and it's a deviation from what Tolkien wrote, but somehow still manages to keep the spirit of it because the dialogue's actually good, and that's appalling that a video game has better dialogue than an actual show written for Tolkien, for written as an adaptation of Tolkien's work for the screen. Double A asks, when's season 2 coming out? I actually haven't found that out. I'll probably find that out later. If anyone knows that, please put that in the chat because I don't know. Like I said, I saw people's messages to my DMs, Callum, especially yours, about what episode 8 concerned, the contents of it. I avoided that like the plague. As soon as I saw a message from somebody who I knew to be my subscriber, I ignored it. I was like, you will not ruin this episode for me. I am not looking at it. I'm not looking at your message. I'm sorry. Because I wanted to watch it and see how I've reacted to the episode. So I've really kept away from watching people's reactions and looking at write-ups and articles about the show. I will probably do that now that it's over, and I'm going to be doing a comparison between Rings of Power and House of Dragons. So I'm probably going to read up on everything that was surrounding the show when I talk about it, because I do think it's important, especially as people who write or like writing. Um, I think it's important to know the context of the time that you're writing in, because that's one thing a lot of writers don't take into consideration. You are living in a particular context, and so how your novel or how your work is received is going to be affected by the context that you're living in. And I think that Rings of Power both tried to manipulate its context by accusing the fans of racism and sexism, knowing that we were living in a context that such accusations are taken very seriously by social media. And it also fell victim to its context of being a work that is an adaptation of Tolkien, because it has fans. That the context is the fans love this work, and so anything that's an adaptation of Tolkien's work is going to be scrutinized more heavily than perhaps other fandoms. And so in that small example, we can see how the context of the show and of the times that we're living in played on how the show was received and how certain things played out with the marketing and stuff like that. So yeah, all that to say, I will do more reading around the context of the show. Du- 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 du. Double A. So Callum says in replying to Double A Holy Trinity willing not for a very long time. So Callum hopes that we will not see season 2 for a long time. So Ragnar said, okay. Callum also says paparazzi people never learn, do they? In response to the comment I made about Princess Diana, about how the media was the cause of her death, and yet for some reason, the media seems to act like they loved Diana from the beginning. When, if we just go on the internet, which has the historical articles that were written about Diana and has all the titles, the media hated Diana when she was alive, but seemed to act like, oh no, we were best buddies and we loved her. She was the people's princess. That Moncure was only given to her after she died. That's what most people don't know. She was not loved at all. She was looked at as sort of the failed princess. Neutron Ball says that Nori doesn't add anything for sure. That's true. While, like I was saying, she's a likable character, she doesn't really add anything. Siraka says, do you know what I do with such characters? I write side stories starring them and include those in the anthologies. Definitely. And I think that's what Tolkien did as well. For the main trilogy, a lot of the things that go on in the main trilogy are important to the main trilogy. And the interesting characters and the stories that came out of that, and all of the side characters who could be fleshed out, they go in the appendices and they go in the unfinished tales and they go in the Silmarillion and they go in everything else, but they're not in the actual trilogy and the Hobbit, which were the books that were sort of designed to be published, whereas the Silmarillion was just sort of the notes and the background and the histories of everything that was compiled after Tolkien's death by his son. Double A says, honestly, as someone who was born after Diana's death, it's interesting to see the crown. It made me feel like I was in the loop when it comes to Diana and the 80s royal gossip. Yes, I mean, I was also born after Diana's death, but um I grew up in, I don't know if you're British, but I grew up here and kind of have an insider's point of view when it comes to how our media works and how fickle it can be. So I've never sort of believed British media. I've always taken it with a pinch of salt because I've seen how they can support you one day and absolutely hate you the next. And it has nothing to do with you personally. It's just on what will sell. And we seem to have an obsession with negativity. We like people doing the wrong thing. I don't know why we like it so much, but we just like reading about people doing the wrong thing and people just being the worst thing that's ever happened. And so with the monarchy, Diana was being portrayed as the worst thing that ever happened to the monarchy in a very similar way that Megan is now being portrayed. It doesn't matter what these people are really like in real life. It doesn't matter what they're going through. It's just what will sell the most copies. Oh, double A, you're British as well. Hello, my fellow Brit. But yeah, so you'll definitely understand that sentiment of how fickle we can be, and we're even experiencing that fickleness now with people like Liz Truss, who our current prime minister, and how she fired Kwasi Kosem, who for for something that she was involved in the making of, she threw him under the bus and fired him just 36 days after she appointed him. So we just love to see people fail in Britain, which is as much as I love Britain, as much as I love being here and and growing up here, and this is very much my home, but it's Britain and we're a lot. But yeah, Double A says, "Don't Brits love to see people fail?" Oh, we do. We love it more than success. Oh, we love failure for some reason, and we love to bash people and just talk about people in the most negative way. We don't like success stories for some reason in Britain, especially when it comes to those in power. We just love stories of people just being the worst, and we love using that word, the worst thing that ever happened to the monarchy, an absolute disgrace, a travesty. We just love that for some reason, and I think it's one of our weakest aspects. Our media is just so insidious. But yeah, Callum says that explains why Harry Hill hosts You've Been Framed. Uh, so Callum says I'm British and I'm Scottish. Oh yes, a very complicated history there, Callum. Double A says, well, so you're under 20, you're 25 or under. Yes, I'm actually two. I haven't even reached 23 yet. That will be in February of the coming year. So I was born in 2000, 2000 baby. And yeah, so a lot of people, you are forgiven for thinking I'm older. A lot of people do think I'm older, but yes, I'm 22 years of age, going on 23, even though some mornings I wake up and it feels like I'm going on 60. Right, it's coming on 3 hours for this live stream. Double A, have you finished your dishes? Double A says Americans love to see people succeed. On the other hand, yes, I think um, when it comes, America is sort of based on meritocracy. They love a success story. The whole concept of the American dream is just people succeeding. Whereas with Britain, because we're so classist, um, it's difficult for us to accept a sort of a climb in the world. It's sort of difficult for us to accept people moving up from their social hierarchy, and that's why in Britain there's constantly this message of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and it feels like there's always being pitted the poor against the rich, which is not the case. But you know, that's Britain for you. Neutron Ball says still 3 years to go to a full adult. Um, Double A says not quite yet. Still rinsing the potato masher when I asked if you finished the dishes. Oh my god, it's 3 hours. I might have to leave you high and dry because it's coming up on 3 hours. I might have to leave you, Neutron. Sorry, Double A. And you're also 19, born in 2002. Wow, imagine being born after 2000. Imagine being born after 2000. That's a lot. So let's see. But yeah, just going back to Rings of Power after our little diversion to Britain and its politics and media. But yeah, I definitely will be watching season two. Um, I just want to see how much this will crash and burn, and I also want to see if it gets better. So yeah, that's my take on it. As far as the series so far, like I've been saying, there are bits that are good, but in comparison to the bits that are sort of negative or not really done well, I think that they outweigh it. I don't think the series can survive if it was independent of Tolkien and his name. And that's saying a lot when your storyline can't really survive independent of the name of the author to sell it. House of Dragon is written in such a way that if we didn't know it was a Game of Thrones spin-off, the story itself is strong enough to stand on its own. It's intriguing enough. The premise is intriguing. Whereas the premise of Rings of Power does not feel very developed. And it doesn't feel as if it's been refined, which is a problem when you have a billion-dollar series that feels like a first draft or feels like a work in progress. But yeah, that's my sort of overall thoughts, and I've officially finished with my commentary. I'm literally just waiting for Double A to finish with his washing. Okay, so Callum, you're 24. Wow, a whole 19 in front of your birthday. Wow, imagine being born before 2000. So, neutron ball, Callum says. Double A says, did you go to Oxbridge? No, I did not, actually. I didn't. I went to the same uni as my father, which was City University of London. And I went there just because the alumni was literally just famous politicians that we know, which is Margaret Thatcher went there. I think Theresa May did a master's there as well. So we had like a lot of prestigious people who went there. So I decided to go there too. They also gave me an unconditional offer, which was great. um Aragva says, I almost expected you to say you went to Hogwarts. I mean, there's the small issue of Hogwarts not existing, but if it did, I definitely would have gone to Hogwarts because even if I was born without a shred of magic, of I think everyone who sort of knows me personally and knows how mischievous I can be, I probably would have snuck into Hogwarts. I would probably would have made history as the first Muggle to break into Hogwarts, and yeah, and I would find a way to keep my memories. And I wouldn't tell anyone about it. I would just become a part of the magical society. Double A says, very nice. Aragma says, not existing, speaking for the muggles, wink wink, nudge nudge. Yes, for all the muggles, Hogwarts doesn't exist. Definitely. Definitely. Um, Aragma says, I wish I was a kid again, though it wasn't rosy growing up under the communist regime. Oh, where did you grow up? Because a lot of like Eastern European sort of countries, the Baltic states, Russia, that sort of area, so are you from around there? Because I know a few people who um are from those areas. One of my best friends, Nick, is Russian, so even though he didn't grow up under that regime, his parents did. Oh, you're from Eastern Bulgaria. Okay. It's very interesting. It's, it's nice. Yay! So the reason I'm clapping is Double A has finished the dishes. Well done, lad. And with that, we are ending this live stream. Thank you for finishing the dishes. I'm I'm glad that we could do this together. I feel like it's been a group effort. I've just spoken and entertained you through it. Huzzah, indeed. Callum and Aragma both say huzzah. Thy dishes are cleansed. Yes. Thank goodness. In the background, I can hear that people are moving around. They're probably like, Malika, you've been speaking for far too long, and we can't stay silent for you to do this live stream. And yes, I've been thoroughly cautioned on the time. But thank you so much for coming to this live stream. You guys have made this very entertaining. I'm glad that we kind of branched out and spoke about different things. But as you can see, I am extremely tired. So I'm going to end this. Let's see. Callum says, but what about the dishes, Malika? You must speak of the dishes. Aragna says, bread should be out of the oven soon. And Double A says, thank you very much. You are very welcome. Neutron Ball says, it was fun to hang out with you guys. It's always fun to hang out with you guys. I always have a great time. And yes, Callum, I'm speaking about the dishes. I'm speaking about the dishes. I hope all the dishes are clean and that you've wiped them and put them in the cupboard so that they don't gain watermarks. Um, double A. Yes, farewell, Shield Maiden. Thank you very much. Bye, guys. I hope that you have a great evening, morning, wherever you are. It's night time for me, so I look forward to sleep. But thank you very much. And this has been the Malika Writes channel. Bye bye.